I have grown up in the outdoors and have been hunting and fishing my entire life. From a childhood spent in North Georgia to stints in West Virginia, and now, for the past 16 years in Virginia, I have spent a great bit of time in the woods. I know animals and flora, and that is why what occurred back in the fall of 2003 has bothered me so much to this day, enough to finally submit this report. My former roommate's father owns the property that this incident took place on. I have had access to it since I was 15. It's a small sportsman's paradise, nearly 200 acres, and a 5-acre bass pond. I had hunted it every fall since 1994 and had fished there for years before that. I hit the woods, completely scent-proof, right around 3:30 a.m., hiked from the farmhouse approximately 600 yards back to the deer stand that I was planning on using that morning. I stopped short, about 100 yards to apply a drag rope, which is doe in rut scent, and then crossed the creek bridge, walked a wide pattern out in front of the stand, and put several scent markers on the game trails. This took perhaps 15 minutes, and no game animals were spooked. I then headed back towards the tree stand, tied off my rifle and gear to a safety rope, climbed the stand, and pulled up my gear. This would give me a full hour and a half to let the woods settle down and help my presence go unnoticed. What happened next has cost me countless nights of sleep and still gives me chills every time I think about it. Once in the stand, I went about the business of sorting out my gear, making sure everything was where I would need it. Binoculars, a grunt collar, etc. Out of nowhere came the most god-awful, blood-curdling scream, yell, growl that I ever heard in my life. The morning calm was completely shattered, and it sounded close. I immediately ran the mental list in my mind as to what it could be. But nothing I'd ever heard before could match this in either pitch, depth, or duration. It lasted for at least 5 to 7 seconds. I was scared. It started so high, and just kept expanding in pitch into a howl that ended in a menacing guttural growl. Before the sound was even over, I felt extreme danger. The real fear was from the fact that the volume was so loud, it came up on me so suddenly that I knew it was close. Too close. Within, say, 25 yards. Following the howl, there was total silence. Immediately, I felt too close to the ground, for whatever reason, and a 17-foot tree stand, and carefully stood up so that my feet were not dangling off the seat. I pulled out my mag light and began scanning the area to my front and right that seemed to sound where it was coming from. I attempted to listen for further movement while scanning, but realizing that my ears were actually ringing from this howl. I remember thinking, from previous survival training, to keep cool and not panic. Figure this out. I quickly chambered around, checked to make sure the safety was on my rifle, a Winchester Model 70. I then continued scanning between the woods to my front and the pine thicket to my immediate right with my flashlight. I just felt so vulnerable, and remember thinking that this rifle might not be enough, so I fetched my Smith & Wesson .40 handgun from my backpack and secured it tightly to my belt. I know that it's unlawful to carry a sidearm during rifle season, but there are black bear on this property. I wasn't going to leave myself without any option. It took several moments for my hearing to return, and when it did, I heard distinctive movement back in the pine thicket to my right and front, maybe 20 yards into the trees. Then nothing. That's when the smell hit me. I'm not sure I noticed it at first, because I had been handling deer scents. but I smelt what I can only describe as rotten cabbage or a ripe Dempster. It didn't last long, and there was no noticeable wind at the time of the incident to carry this scent toward me. I stood there in that tree stand for the next 2 hours until first light, then got out of there. I'm not the type to scare easily, and I was right back out there 2 days later, but did not think to check for tracks or any other evidence. The game was still scarce. I've been back several times since to fish the pond. Nothing out of the ordinary ever occurred during those trips. I totally forgot about this incident for nearly a year. It bothered me, so I just didn't think about it. That changed when I caught a documentary on TV concerning Bigfoot and Sasquatch. The BFRO was mentioned, and I found this website. I also read a report near this in Franklin County, but was even further stunned when I listened to some of the recordings that are found in this database. They sounded very similar to the very beginning of the howl during my incident, but the sound I heard was so close and loud, and went so deep at the end, that they are tough to compare. Whatever made that noise had one hell of a set of lungs, though. I was also surprised about that smell they supposedly emit when threatened. I had no idea. That was the icing on the cake that made me think that I might have possibly had an encounter. I've always been somebody comfortable in the woods, and for the most part, I'm still him, just a little more aware of what could possibly be out there. Everything that deer season had an odd feel to it, come to think about it. And as I previously stated, I had been hunting and fishing this property for well over 10 years. The place was absolutely eerie. In the previous 2 deer and turkey seasons, I had harvested 6 and 8-point bucks, several does, and numerous turkeys. In the fall of 2003, however, the wildlife just seemed to be gone or in hiding. Even during the early muzzleloader archery season, the deer seemed very scarce. I was riding my ATV on a family farm, going down an old, washed-out road, which you can't drive fast on. As I started down the road, looking down, then looking up and down the road, something caught my eye. Around 200 yards down this road, the sun was to my left, shining across this road to the right. As I looked down this narrow road, there was a reflection of light coming off the fur of something that I've never seen before. It was tall and massive, for that split second that I saw it. The way the sun's reflection came off this thing, it looked almost silver. But being a hunter, since I hunt this land all the time, there is not anything silver in color, and that the sun coming off the back of a black turkey can look silver. So that's what caught my eye. This animal went back into the woods, back to the right. So I worked my way down to where I thought I saw it, turning my ATV off and smoked a cigarette, listening for anything about 5 minutes. Had passed and I heard something big running away from my direction, breaking tree limbs. It was way louder than a deer running through the thickets. I could hear this for about 1 or 2 seconds. Then it went quiet again. If I had to guess how far away it was, I would say about 50 to 60 yards away from me when I first heard the running. You can't see more than 20 yards in this thicket from where I was at. Hunting season ends for general firearms 10 days before this, so the deer are still alert. Then, it seemed like a couple of minutes later, I heard 2 big bangs, like somebody hitting a stick against a tree or a log. Then, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Then, there was the snorting of the deer that came from the thicket right after that. When a deer snorts, from my experience in the woods during the day, they see you and snort once or twice. Then they take off, leaving you, just to see their white tail waving at you as they go out of sight. But There must have been 4 or 5 whitetail in there, all of them snorting and stomping the ground, and they were real loud. The deer did this for about what seemed to be more than a minute. Then I heard them take off running. That's when I decided it was time for me to leave too. I go home and told my wife about what had just happened. She couldn't believe it, was surprised at what I had told her, and asked if it was a bear. I told her I never saw a bear in the woods, and it seemed way too big to be a black bear. So the next day, Wednesday the 22nd, I wasn't going back that day. I took a camera in where I heard this animal, and took pictures of what I believed to be footprints and some hair that was left on a tree limb about 5.5 feet off the ground. In college, my social club would go camping twice a year for a bonding event with our newer members. We would go in late November after the Thanksgiving holiday and again in early April. A group of about 40 to 50 of us would set up campsite with a large bonfire. We would spend most of the night in the woods, just doing guy things, like drinking, telling stories. Invariably, we'd get louder as the night went on. But you have to understand, it was a very remote area, not suitable for camping of any type of excursion. We camped at the bottom of a large, steep descent that was a very dangerous, rocky climb down. Once we left the cars, even in full moonlight, the trees would be so thick it was pitch black and nearly impossible to see our way down. So, we were equipped with flashlights at all times. All 3 incidents occurred in the same area, in the fall of '94 and spring and fall of '95. The most unnerving occurred in the fall of '95, causing most of our members to go home early because most feared we'd be shot at by hunters. We observed, audibly, not visually, rock throwing and very strange howling noises that got closer and closer until we quieted down. Then, the noises seemed to abate somewhat. On the night of fall of '95, we camped next to a small stream that ran down the mountain and could hear rocks being tossed into downstream. We all assumed it was some of our guys, since, usually, someone would wander off in hopes of scaring us. This night, though, it kept occurring, so we sent out some of our guys to make sure we had accounted for everybody, and we had. We had to keep a head count because we took as few cars as possible, didn't want to leave anybody stranded. Once we were all accounted for, the noises got louder and closer, and it was unmistakably the large rocks that dominated the hillside, being tossed into each other and into the stream. We all fell silent, and the few hunters in the group told us it might be a buck, just wandering the stream. But then we heard a loud, continuous wailing sound. Nobody could identify for certain. We all, despite our intoxication and testosterone levels, got very, very quiet and tried communicating back in hopes it was a hunter who was just lost. As we were calling out into the night, more rocks were thrown, more odd noises occurring. They were long wails, or howls, and the occasional grunt, similar to what a large ape sounds like when agitated. Whatever or whoever it was agitated, and was definitely attempting to frighten us. After some time had passed, most of our guys decided they wanted no part of what we thought was a few hunters out to scare us. So, most left. About 10 or 15 of us remained through dawn, knowing that running wildly in the dark would be more dangerous than fending off some drunks. We remained far, far quieter, heard more rocks being tossed in our direction, along with a few grunts, but only intermittently, and they seemed to grow more distant as the night wore on. On the previous 2 trips, I didn't stay the entire night, but, on each one, we heard the same odd cries and rocks being tossed nearby at other rocks and trees. We always chalked it up to hunters trying to scare the college kids away, but nobody ever replied, and the screams and cries we heard were definitely not from a dog. The fall of '95 trip was one that is most clear in my mind, and one that scared a big group of burly guys into heading home at around 2 in the morning, instead of staying the entire night, like usual. It wasn't until recently, when my friend Randy told me about this thing called the BFRO expedition in that region of Virginia, that I even considered it being a Bigfoot. It always had just been a scary night in the black woods of West Virginia. But once he sent me a howl, I had chills up and down my spine when I heard it. Let me add that I am the world's biggest skeptic, and I have routinely dismissed all Bigfoot talk as fantasy. I don't know what it was out there, but after reading about the rock throwing, the grunts, the growls, the expo, and hearing that chilling howl sound bite, my brain tells me it had all the earmarks of a Bigfoot sighting. It was eerie recounting it for Randy, because each telltale question he asked me, I apparently answered in such a way that he was sure it was a Bigfoot sighting. I am in no way convinced, but the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. George Washington and Jefferson National Forest off the Blue Ridge Parkway in Amherst County, Virginia, White Oaks Flats area. Deer hunting from a tree stand, approximately 15 feet high. I arrived way too early, maybe an hour or more before daylight. I climbed into my tree stand and reversed the batteries in my flashlight to keep it from coming back on in my pack, as I usually hunt all day until after dark in the evening. I settled down and was waiting for shooting light. Quite some time had passed, enough time for everything to grow quiet and me to cool off from the hike to my tree stand. Without any warning, directly underneath my stand came the most terrible sound imaginable. It started as a low guttural roar, somewhat as a lion or a large cat might make, then ascended in scale until it was a horrifying, piercing scream, lasting several seconds, or at least seemed to. I cannot describe how scary, unnerving this scream was. No proper words to convey it, really. It was awful. After gathering my wits, I comforted myself that I had loaded my .30-06, and nothing on earth could survive a 15-foot climb up that tree. I sat very still, strained every sense I had for whatever it was to reveal itself. I made no attempt to retrieve my light and reverse the batteries. I really thought I was about to be attacked by something that only the word monster could convey. That night was a totally moonless night, absolutely dark, but the leaves, they were very, very dry, crunching underfoot. I absolutely knew that nothing could move that close to me without revealing its whereabouts via sound. So I sat and waited until daylight. I saw nothing. The area was somewhat dense at ground level, with laurel. My tree stand was above the growth. I'm a lifelong hunter, and have spent thousands of hours in the mountains. Nothing could have moved that closely under that condition, without sound. But it not only approached my tree stand, it also left without a sound. After daylight, I searched for tracks, spoor, hair in the area. There was nothing. Up until the day I always walked to my tree stands with my rifle unloaded. Never loaded it until I was in my stand. Needless to say that has stopped. I would walk no more in those woods with an unloaded gun than I would attempt to fly. I was embarrassed. Did not wish to be labeled as somebody that told tall tales. But I did tell those that hunted with me in that area. And for one reason, genuine concern for their safety. I know what I heard. It was large, horrible, menacing. The thing I heard was no laughing matter. Words can't convey the seriousness of what I heard. I also drove to the peaks of Otter and told the ranger there, asked if anyone had ever heard of or reported of strange sounds, as I had heard a monster. They had reports, he told me, then tried to convince me that I just heard an owl. This was insulting. I've hunted all my life, killed most every type of animal in Virginia. This was no owl. Even if it was a large bird of some kind, I was so close that I would have heard wing beats or the rush of air as it flapped to get airborne. I heard nothing but the roar. I might add that it became a matter of courage to continue hunting in that area, but I did. And in the general area, killed a deer and a black bear that year. No one hunting with me anything that day, but later on in the season, I think the same week, 2 people heard the same thing on a ridge above the car after hunting all day and returning to the car after dark. The reason I am supplying my story now is that while recently, at the YMCA, working out, I overheard a conversation about somebody encountering what they thought was a Bigfoot. Apparently, they also smelt the same thing, but I didn't smell anything. What I heard was more than enough.